Imagine you're the CEO of a major Australian financial institution. You don't write code, you don't configure firewalls, you spend your days looking at interest rate models and shareholder reports.
Right. Usual executive stuff.
Exactly. But tomorrow morning, if a third-party software vendor that, say, your HR department hired gets hacked, the government holds you personally and legally responsible for the fallout.
It's a terrifying thought for them.
It really is. So welcome to the WeCyberYou Unlocked podcast deep dive. Before we jump into how this scenario became the daily reality for executives, hit that follow button right now. We're constantly breaking down the frameworks that are, fundamentally rewiring the digital economy, and you want to ensure you never miss these explorations.
Yeah. And today's topic is a phenomenal case study in regulatory evolution. We are looking at APRA CPS 234 today, which is Australia's Prudential standard for cyber resilience.
Right. And the mission for this deep dive is to understand the actual mechanics of this standard, like how it drags cybersecurity out of the basement IT server room and elevates it into a core Prudential and really a business survival metric.
Which is a massive shift.
It's huge. And to really frame this, we have to rethink how we visualize a bank's security. In the past, people loved the analogy of a standalone submarine. You build a thick, watertight hull, secure the main hatch, and you're safe.
Yeah, which worked perfectly when financial networks were heavily siloed, right? When everything was entirely on-premise.
But the modern financial sector isn't a submarine anymore. It's more like an interconnected power grid. If a small substation down the street, say, a third-party analytics vendor gets overloaded, the entire city's grid can trip.
Oh, absolutely.
And the neighborhood surrounding that grid is currently filled with highly coordinated, automated threat actors who are just constantly probing for a single weak link.
And that interconnected vulnerability is exactly what forced the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, or APRA, to step in.
They had to do something.
Right. They looked at the threat landscape and realized the financial sector had reached a tipping point. On one side, you have this industrialization of cybercrime. Sophisticated ransomware as a service, nation-state actors targeting critical infrastructure, and really complex supply chain attacks.
And then on the other side, you have a massive expansion of the attack surface itself.
Exactly. Banks were rushing to adopt cloud-native architectures, digital-first banking platforms, and remote workforce infrastructure. The dependence on digital ecosystems just became absolute.
It was everywhere all at once.
Yeah. So APRA recognized that a cyber incident in this environment, it isn't just an IT outage anymore. It is a direct threat to consumer trust, the stability of the Australian financial system, and national economic resilience.
Right, because if a major clearinghouse goes down due to a ransomware attack, the ripple effects freeze the broader economy.
Exactly. So the regulator mandated that the management of this power grid gets fundamentally overhauled.
But to really grasp CPS 234, we have to look at the philosophical shift it forces upon an organization, right? Because this isn't just a mandate to buy more expensive security software.
No, not at all. It is a complete departure from traditional compliance. The foundational philosophy of CPS 234 is that it's outcome-focused. It totally abandons those old checklist-based compliance frameworks the industry leaned on for decades.
Well, let's pause there, because the old way of doing things was notoriously flawed.
Oh, heavily flawed.
Yeah, previously, a bank's risk department could just check a box saying, yes, we deployed an endpoint detection tool, pass an annual static audit, and basically walk away feeling secure. How does an outcome-focused model actually prevent that kind of lazy compliance?
By demanding continuous assurance rather than point-in-time validation. The old model asked, do you have the tool?
Right.
But CPS 234 asks, can you prove today that the tool actually stopped the simulated threat we threw at it? And the mechanism the regulation uses to enforce this continuous assurance is quite clever. It points straight to requirement 2, which is board accountability.
Which brings us back to our CEO waking up to a total nightmare.
Spot on. CPS 234 elevates cyber resilience directly into the boardroom and the audit committees.
Wow.
Yeah, the board of directors and senior management, they are explicitly responsible for overseeing the cyber strategy. They have to ensure the security controls are commensurate with the size and extent of the threats they actually face.
That is a massive operational shift. The IT director is no longer the sole person sweating out a data breach.
Right. It's not just the IT guy's problem anymore.
It reframes cybersecurity as a critical governance issue. But I have to imagine that causes massive friction. I mean, boards are usually filled with finance, legal, and operations experts. How do they suddenly govern highly technical cyber controls?
Well, they do it by translating cyber risk into business risk. When the board is accountable for the outcomes, they stop approving blind budgets for firewalls, and they start demanding metrics they can actually understand.
So they're looking for real operational numbers.
Exactly. They want to see the mean time to detect a breach. They want to see the mean time to respond. They require independent audits, proving that the organization's recovery time objective, the time it takes to restore operations after a total failure, can actually be met in reality, not just on some spreadsheet.
Because their own necks are on the line?
Yeah, they need empirical proof, because the regulator will hold them liable if the system fails.
So if the board is now legally holding the bag for a breach, they are obviously going to look at their most vulnerable attack vectors. And in modern banking, that usually means the vendors, right?
Absolutely.
Because nobody builds proprietary chat clients or CRM databases in-house anymore. So who exactly falls under the umbrella of this regulation?
Well, at its core, CPS 234 applies to all APRA-regulated entities. So that includes banks, credit unions, insurance providers, and superannuation funds.
Basically any entity holding substantial public wealth in Australia.
Right. But because of how modern infrastructure works, the regulation's impact cascades far beyond just those financial institutions. It heavily impacts cloud service providers, managed service providers, and outsourced tech vendors.
Okay, let me throw a real-world scenario at this to see how that cascading effect works.
Sure, go for it.
Let's say a major Australian bank decides to migrate all its customer data analytics to a state-of-the-art software-as-a-service platform. 6 months later, that SaaS platform suffers a major data exfiltration event. Under CPS 234, can the bank just point fingers at the vendor and say to the regulator, hey, we bought a secure product, they breached their SLA, penalize them?
They absolutely cannot. And that brings us to Requirement 7, which covers third-party and supply chain security.
Ah, okay.
The regulation establishes a very rigid standard here. Accountability cannot be outsourced.
So outsourcing the data processing does not outsource the responsibility for the security outcome.
Exactly. The bank remains fully liable.
The regulated entity remains completely on the hook.
Yes. Under Requirement 7, the bank must actively assess the security controls of their third parties and continuously monitor those outsourced environments. They need independent assurance that the SaaS platform is protecting the data with the exact same rigor the bank itself would apply.
I have to play devil's advocate here, though. It sounds great on paper to say a bank is accountable for a third-party vendor, but practically speaking, hyperscalers like Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure are not going to let an Australian regional bank send an auditor into their core data centers.
No, of course not.
So how does a bank actually enforce Requirement 7 against a global tech giant?
That is the operational friction everyone ran into when this was first rolled out. You are correct that hyperscalers won't allow physical audits, so instead, the industry relies on rigorous shared responsibility models and continuous monitoring.
What does that look like?
Banks demand comprehensive third-party audit reports, like SOC 2 Type 2, which prove the continuous operating effectiveness of the vendor's controls. And furthermore, banks now use third-party risk management platforms that continuously scan the external attack surface of their vendors.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they're constantly looking for misconfigurations, leaked credentials on the dark web, or unpatched vulnerabilities.
So they are essentially monitoring the vendor's perimeter from the outside, just constantly.
Yes, and for smaller vendors, the banks actually do send in auditors. I mean, if you are a mid-sized software company and you want to sell a product to an Australian bank, you have to prove your security meets their regulatory burden.
That's a huge shift for those smaller companies.
It is. It forces the entire supply chain to elevate their security posture.
Okay, so knowing that the board is accountable and that they have to monitor this incredibly complex web of vendors, how do these massive financial institutions execute this day to day? Because a legacy bank might have, 40 years of technical debt and thousands of servers. Where do they even start?
Well, the execution playbook begins with Requirement 3, which is information asset identification and classification.
Because you cannot protect what you don't know exists.
That is the fundamental truth of security architecture. Organizations must deploy automated discovery tools to identify all their information assets. Then, they classify those assets based on criticality and sensitivity.
And that has to be an immense undertaking.
Oh, it is. It's not just labeling customer databases. It includes mapping the legacy financial systems, tracking ephemeral cloud workloads, and mapping those third-party API connections.
Right.
They have to map all the dependencies. Like, if a seemingly insignificant middleware server goes down, does it break the authentication loop for the mobile banking app?
Right, so they have to map the entire power grid and understand how the electricity flows, essentially.
Exactly.
So once they have that map, what is the next operational step?
Once the assets are classified, they move to requirement 4, which is security controls implementation. Entities must deploy technical and administrative controls proportional to the risk level of the assets.
So we are talking about the actual defensive mechanisms here. Let's break down how those work under this specific standard.
Sure. The standard requires defense in depth.
Yeah.
First, strong encryption for data, both at rest and in transit.
Okay.
If an attacker breaches the network and steals a database, the data should be mathematically unreadable to them. Then you have robust network segmentation.
Right, to stop them from moving around.
Exactly. If an attacker compromises a marketing employee's laptop, segmentation ensures they cannot easily pivot laterally into the core banking network.
And what about managing the access itself? Because stolen credentials are, the primary way attackers bypass that segmentation.
That requires privileged access management, or PAM.
Let's explain the mechanism of PAM for a second, because it's a really critical concept. Instead of giving a system administrator a permanent master key to the network, PAM acts more like a time-bound token, right?
Yes, it is highly context-aware. So if an administrator needs to update a critical database, they don't just use a static password they've had for 6 months.
Right.
They request access through a PAM system. The system checks their identity, checks the health of their device, and if everything passes, it provisions a temporary credential that only works for that specific database. And it self-destructs after, say, 1 hour.
Wow. And it's all tracked.
Everything. Every keystroke they make during that hour is logged and recorded.
That drastically reduces the blast radius if that administrator is secretly compromised.
Exactly.
But here is where the outcome-focused part of the regulation comes back into play, right? Because deploying a PAM solution or setting up network segmentation is great, but a control that exists on paper, like setting up a security camera, if nobody checks that the lens is blocked, it's totally useless in reality.
Yes, which brings us to requirement 5. Testing, assurance, and continuous validation.
Okay.
The core operational mantra of CPS 234 is really trust but verify. Security cannot be a static deployment. Organizations have to aggressively test their assumptions.
So what does that aggressive testing actually look like in practice for a major bank?
Well, it happens in layers. At the base level, they run continuous automated vulnerability assessments, constantly scanning their code and infrastructure for known weak spots.
Okay.
Moving up, they conduct targeted penetration testing, where ethical hackers attempt to exploit specific applications. But the most rigorous mechanism is a full-scale red team exercise.
Let's dive into red teaming, because this isn't just running an automated software scanner. It's actual adversarial simulation.
Right. A red team exercise simulates a highly sophisticated real-world attack against the entire organization.
Wow.
The red team doesn't just look for missing software patches. They might attempt to spearfish the chief financial officer using AI-generated voice clones.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. They might drop malicious USB drives in the bank's physical parking lot, hoping an employee picks one up and plugs it in.
That's crazy.
They attempt to bypass physical security, compromise an endpoint, establish a command and control connection, and move laterally through the network, all just to see if the bank's internal security team, the blue team, can actually detect them.
So they are paying friendly adversaries to find the structural flaws in the power grid before the real threat actors do.
Yes.
And crucially, because of requirement 2, the board of directors is reviewing the outcomes of those red team exercises.
Exactly. The board reviews those outcomes to ensure the bank's actual detection and response capabilities match their documented risk appetite.
Right.
If the red team easily exfiltrates simulated customer data without triggering any alarms, the board knows the security controls are ineffective, regardless of how much money they spent on them.
That continuous validation loop is powerful. But, we have to look at the worst case scenario.
Of course.
Even with board oversight, stringent vendor management, PAM, and constant red teaming, 0-day vulnerabilities happen. Human error happens. What happens when an advanced threat actually slips through the cracks and compromises a regulated entity?
Well, that harsh reality is addressed in Requirement 6, Incident Detection and Response.
Oh.
The regulation acknowledges that breaches are just inevitable. It demands that organizations maintain the capability to detect incidents rapidly, contain the damage, and recover operations within defined timeframes. But there is a very strict regulatory tripwire built into this requirement.
Ooh, what is the tripwire?
Regulated entities must notify APRA as soon as possible and no later than 72 hours after becoming aware of an information security incident that materially affects or even have the potential to materially affect the entity.
A 72-hour notification window. That is an incredibly tight turnaround when an organization is right in the middle of a crisis.
It really is.
What constitutes a material incident, though? Does a single employee clicking a phishing link trigger a regulatory notification to the government?
No, not typically. A material incident generally means an event that significantly degrades critical systems, exposes sensitive customer information, or threatens the availability of core financial services.
Ah, okay. That makes more sense.
Right. If a bank's mobile application infrastructure is brought down by a distributed denial of service attack, or a database containing loan applications is breached, APRA needs to be notified immediately.
Why is that rapid notification so critical from a macro perspective? Because I feel like the bank is already busy trying to put the fire out. Drafting a regulatory disclosure takes precious resources away from actual incident response.
It goes back to the power grid analogy. APRA's primary mandate is to protect the stability of the entire Australian financial system, not just one isolated bank.
Okay, I see.
If Bank A is getting hit by a novel ransomware strain that targets a specific brand of firewall, APRA needs that intelligence immediately.
So they can warn everyone else.
Exactly. They can take that threat intelligence and quietly warn Bank B, Bank C, and Bank D to patch their systems or look for specific indicators of compromise.
Rapid notification prevents systemic contagion.
Yes. It allows the regulator to act as an information clearinghouse to protect the broader economy.
This all sounds incredibly rigorous and honestly necessary for national infrastructure. But banking is inherently global, right?
Very much so.
You have institutions operating simultaneously in Sydney, London, Singapore, and New York. How does a localized, Australia-specific standard play nicely with international cybersecurity frameworks? A multinational bank cannot just follow a completely different architectural rulebook in every city they operate in.
No, that regulatory friction was a major consideration in the drafting of CPS 234. If APRA had created a completely bespoke standard, the compliance burden on multinational banks would be completely paralyzing.
Oh, absolutely.
Instead, CPS 234 smartly harmonizes governance, resilience, and operational security by aligning really closely with established global gold standards.
So it basically maps to the frameworks these global banks are already building their architecture around.
That's it.
How does that mapping work in practice?
Well, it breaks down into specific domains.
Sure.
For overarching information security governance, CPS 234 aligns with ISO 27001, which is the international standard for information security management systems.
Okay.
Then, for the granular technical controls, the encryption, the network segmentation, the access management we talked about, aligns heavily with the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology, specifically NIST Special Publication 853.
Which is basically the global encyclopedia of security controls.
Yes, exactly. And it doesn't stop there. For business continuity and disaster recovery, it maps to ISO 22301. For incident response procedures, it aligns with NIST SP 861.
So how does a global bank leverage that alignment to avoid doing the exact same work twice?
They use governance, risk, and compliance platforms, GRC platforms, to cross-map their controls.
Oh, clever.
Yeah, let's say a bank implements a robust logging and monitoring system on their servers. That single technical action can be mapped in their software to satisfy a NIST 853 control for their U.S. operations, an ISO 27001 requirement for their European operations, and a CPS 234 requirement for APRA in Australia.
So they build the security architecture once to a really high global watermark and then basically just translate the evidence into the local regulatory language.
That is the reality of modern compliance. CPS 234 sets a formidable standard, but it speaks the international language of cybersecurity to facilitate compliance rather than obstruct it.
Wow. Let's pull all these threads together and look at the big picture of what this regulation has really achieved.
Sure.
APRA CPS 234 fundamentally re-engineered how an entire nation's financial sector approaches digital risk. It removed the complacency of checklist compliance. It elevated cyber risk out of the shadows of the IT department and placed it firmly in the boardroom, forcing executives to treat digital resilience with the exact same gravity as financial liquidity.
And it acknowledged that a bank is only as secure as the weakest vendor in its supply chain. It demands continuous proof that the defenses protecting the financial grid are actually working in real-world conditions.
It is a fascinating evolution, and it really provides a blueprint for how other critical sectors might need to be regulated in the future.
I agree.
If you want to dive deeper into frameworks like this or explore the other critical architectures shaping the digital landscape, we highly encourage you to visit WeCyberYou.com for more deep dives and content just like this.
The regulatory landscape is going to continue adapting rapidly as the technology accelerates.
Without a doubt. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. We just spent this time analyzing how massive, well-resourced financial institutions are now legally mandated to treat every app, every cloud platform, and every third-party software update as a potential existential threat to their business.
Right.
They spend millions continuously verifying that their vendors aren't leaving a digital backdoor open. So, take a look at the third-party applications and the cloud services running on your own personal devices right now. Or look at the software running the payroll for your small business.
It's a scary thought.
It really is. You might not be safeguarding a billion-dollar treasury, but you are managing a network of highly sensitive personal data. If massive banks are terrified of third-party risk, well, who is holding your vendors accountable for your security? Who is checking the padlocks on your digital grid?
Yeah.
Something to think about. Until next time.